Hello, my name is Malcolm Skinner and I'm a solicitor in the LexisNexis Private Client PSL team. Today I'm joined by Jacqui Lazare, TEP, who is a solicitor at Royds Withy King and is also a member of STEP's Philanthropy Advisors Global Special Interest Group Committee. Today we're going to be discussing how trustees of charities and fiduciaries might limit their risk. Jacqui, welcome.
Hello.
So generally, what's the issue?
Well, the issue for charitable trusts really is that there is a massively increased scrutiny and regulation of them over the last couple of years. And for trustees and for advisors to trustees, it's going to be really important to be aware of how to mitigate those risks and how to make sure they are continuing to discharge their duties as trustees properly and complying with best practice and governance and so on. So yeah, that's the context. That's really
the crux, yes. Obviously trustees are going to go to their legal advisors, and what are those legal advisors going to tell them?
There are going to be lots of professionals who are advising trustees and who are going to be acting as trustees as well. And it's going to be really important to come back to the principles of good governance. So I'm conscious that a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be common sense, especially for those experienced trustees or for those professional advisors to a large extent. But having said that, I hope this is still going to serve as a useful reference point, a useful reminder for why these established points of good governance are still very important.
Well, you've mentioned closer scrutiny. What is this climate that we've suddenly found ourselves in?
There are two main prongs to it really. There are a number of new regulatory schemes that have come in particular the automatic exchange of information and the common reporting standard. There will have been quite a lot of press about these separately, and in addition to that, and also well known, will be the scandal from some high profile charities, so in particular Cup Trust and Kids Company. Now, I know they aren't particularly recent, but the ripple effects are still being felt very much by the third sector.
So, key principles in summary?
Yeah, absolutely. There are three key principles when looking at good governance generally. One, risk management. Two, conflicts of interest and good decision making. And thirdly, due diligence.
Well, looking at those, as you've said them, they seem very broad. So can we limit them down a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say is that they are broad. They do pervade multiple jurisdictions and different structures, both working charities, pure grant-making charities, and in some cases, hybrid charitable organisations. But I think if we were to look first at risk management, that would probably be the most helpful. It is a very key part of good governance for trustees and charities. As with any principle that we're going to discuss, it's going to be relevant how big the charity is, what is the charity, because the risks will vary according to each organisation. And so when considering these risks or the implementation, these principles to do with risks and how they're implemented in their organisation, it's really important to be proportionate.
So the risks that you have identified or can identify?
Yeah, no, these are officially identified risks. There are 5 that are recognised within the sector by the Charity Commission and so on. Firstly, external, so this would be damage to a charity's reputation. Maybe there's a change to government policy, something like that. Secondly, financial, so for example, if there are inadequate reserves of income or if a charity has made an inappropriate investment, made a loss. Governance as a risk if, for example, you've got a lack of relevant skills on a trustee board. Operational risk if there's a lack of beneficiary or welfare or safety. And lastly, compliance. So, for example, if within the organisation there is poor knowledge of regulatory requirements regarding fundraising or dealing with operating vehicles. I think it's really important for trustees to remember, yes, it's not a legal requirement for you to have a risk management process in place, but it's incredibly strongly recommended that you do.
I can imagine. The problem that I see there is we're dealing with charities in the widest possible sense, which go from very small charities to very large charities, with everything in between. And the principle of risk management is not always available or understood by all those charities. So how does a charity actually know that they have done the risk management? How do they know what risk management to do?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's so hard, because although the concept is meant to be helpful, and to a large extent it is helpful in risk management, it is incredibly difficult to analyse and feel certain about whether or not you have done enough for your organisation. There are some general principles that all trustees should consider, and then the extent to which they will apply to that organisation should be proportionate. So these will include looking at the charity's objectives, mission and strategy, the nature and scale of its activities, what they're trying to achieve, the external factors that apply to them, so legislation, regulation, that kind of thing. The charity's reputation with major funders and supporters, past mistakes and problems that they've faced, this can be very relevant and helpful to refer back to. Operating structure, if there are trading subsidiaries being used, for example, and sometimes just comparing with other charities. I think from a sort of practical perspective, using trading subsidiaries can be a very useful thing to do to transfer risk and so on. But one tip would be that if you have the trustees of the original charity, then it's very useful for them to ensure that similar risk management processes are adopted by the directors of that trading subsidiary, and that can be very helpful.
That seems logical. So strategies, so where are we with that? How can charities easily identify the risks that they might have?
What they need to try and do is to demonstrate that they have looked at the risks and show that they're prepared for them. Demonstrating that they've identified this gross level of risk and reduced it to a net level is helpful. So, for example, showing what risk has been identified and after steps have been taken, what's left. Strategies could include transference, so like I've mentioned, using a trading subsidiary or outsourcing work to another organisation. Avoidance, so for example, not taking up a contract or stopping a particular service if if a risk has been identified with that. Limitations, so establishing a reserve for a possible loss of income or something like that. Reduction or elimination, so here you would be looking at establishing and improving control procedures. Sharing the risk through a joint venture, insuring against it, speaks for itself, so third party liability or employer's liability. And in some cases it will be simply accepting a risk as a low probability, but the importance of showing that it's been flagged up, it's been recognised, and then making sure it's reviewed so it doesn't get overlooked in the future.
Okay. Well, I know you have practical experience to illustrate this, so do tell us about that.
Certainly. Yes, we did have a nice example actually from just fairly recently, where we acted for a town festival and have done for some time. And they put on a festival every year, and one year they decided to put on a rock concert. And this is absolutely fine. It was perfectly within the auspices of their charitable objects to do so, so there's no concern there. The concern or the risk came from the fact that they had no experience of doing or putting on rock concerts. They were very experienced at classical concerts for their charity, but not rock concerts. So the risk was there was no experience and there could well be a financial loss. And we recommended that they use a trading subsidiary to put on the rock concert. So that was done, and that was created, which was perfectly fine. Unfortunately, contracts were sent out on the wrong headed paper, on the charity's headed paper. So it's such a key error, and unsurprisingly, the concerts did operate at a loss. When the charity then covered that loss, it amounted to an inappropriate use of their funds, and they were subsequently investigated by the Charity Commission. I think what this example highlights is that the trading subsidiary was used for all the right reasons, but it wasn't understood by everyone why it was being used, and it also wasn't understood what practical consequences flowed from using the trading subsidiary to ring fence this risk. unfortunately, it highlights that even where you've identified a risk, put in a strategy for dealing with it, it can still sometimes fail. So making sure everybody is aware of the rationale is also very important.
Well, I'm sure the charity concern learned a lot of lessons from that, but in a wider context, what can we learn from that particular experience?
Yeah, I think it shows how important it is to be aware of all risks, monitor and review them. There are two key things really that processes should include. One being dynamic, so making sure that new risks are addressed as they arise, and being cyclical, so making sure that where previously identified risks have been dealt with, or if they've changed over the course of time. It certainly shouldn't be a one-off process, no matter how big or small your charity is. So although the process can be adapted proportionately, it shouldn't be one-off. It should be very much embedded in the running of the charity.
Okay. Well, changing the theme momentarily, conflict of interest is something that's often pops up in the charity world. In the context of governance, how can charities protect themselves or deal with that sort of instance?
Yeah, I think with conflicts of interest, it's an age-old thing. It applies to lots of other organisations as well and other situations. The bottom line is that it's not possible to make a good decision where a conflict is present. There is a wealth of case law on this subject and a number of principles that have come out of that case law, which can really be summarised as anyone with a fiduciary duty has a duty to avoid a conflict. And identifying conflicts early on and taking steps to manage them is really key. I think a key bit of advice would be that risks can often be created by a lack of paperwork, so that if you've taken advice and you've got a written record of that advice, and then you take a decision based on that advice, and there is a written record of that decision and why it's been taken, what's being taken, and when it was taken, then the trustees are going to be much better protected.
Well, returning then to the theme of mitigating the risk, how can trustees do it in that particular instance of conflict?
I think in a lot of cases, so a lot of charities are already fairly well set up in this respect. Declaring a conflict immediately is the key thing. So no delay, and remembering you're trying to avoid the appearance of a conflict as well. So sometimes even where there is none, you can get into trouble if you haven't declared it. So making sure that that's done is really important. Having a standard agenda item for trustees to declare conflicts at the beginning of the meeting. Having a written policy would be certainly a very good example of good practice, and that should set out how to identify and disclose conflicts, both for existing trustees and to help with prospective new trustees raise them. As I say, a number of charities cover this already, and I think if you've got any instructions on how to manage conflict in your governance documents, follow them strictly, and that will help protect you as well. That would be really, really key.
So we have a situation here, you've highlighted decision making and we've looked at conflict of interest. So these two are linked, obviously.
Absolutely, yeah, they're very, very closely related. When you're looking at what key principles of decision making are, then you're looking at making sure you're acting within your powers, acting in good faith and only in the interest of the charity, making sure that those people taking the decision are sufficiently well informed and taking account of all relevant factors. For trustees, they can only be confident that their decisions are being taken within the range that a reasonable trustee body would make when they follow these principles.
Well, that rather brings us to the third key principle, which is due diligence.
Yeah.
So how does this apply and how can it be dealt with?
This really brings us on to the know your principles, which is something that many professional advisors will be familiar with, and charities, of course. So there is a financial action task force special recommendation number 8, which states that, forgive me, I'll just read this a little bit. Charities should make best efforts to confirm the identity, credentials and good standing of their beneficiaries and associates, and undertake best efforts to document the identity of their significant donors. This summarises what follows really very well.
Okay.
There are three main areas for know your principals: know your donors, know your beneficiaries, and know your partners.
So it sounds fairly obvious, really, when you think about it, but know your donors, what's the risk there?
This is one of the better known ones, yes. This is where abuses of money laundering, such as proceeds of crime or tax evasion, are very well known. There are going to be many charities who have good long-standing relationships with significant donors, and that's great. But I think it's very important to not be complacent about managing that relationship. If, for example, you have any kind of request for a return of all or part of a donation, making sure that's queried and challenged if necessary. And if you have third parties making donations on behalf of anonymous donors, that may not be inappropriate, but it's still important to question, is the third party reputable? If you dealt with them before, is it possible for them to share the details of the donor, albeit on a confidential basis? That kind of thing is very important. Also making sure that you're aware of the, as far as possible, provenance of funds, and being clear about whether or not any conditions are being attached to a gift, and if so, whether those conditions are going to threaten the independence of your charity. It may not be appropriate to accept the gift in those circumstances.
Know your beneficiaries.
This is probably more relevant where you have, or more typically relevant, where you have a charity that makes grants directly available to individual beneficiaries. Again, a common sense and proportionate approach is going to be needed. So essentially the trustee is going to want to know who they are giving the money to, and does that person meet the eligibility criteria? For example, let's say they need to be registered disabled or something like that. And then secondly, is it appropriate to provide the assistance to them? That means, is that assistance going to be used as it's intended?
Sure. I suspect the last of the three we're going to talk about here is possibly the most important. Know your partners, in terms that, you know, it would be very silly to enter into an arrangement with somebody if you didn't know them.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important for a charity to make sure that whichever other organisation they're dealing with, it's an appropriate partnership. And also, if it's not appropriate, then they may be in a position to abuse funds being paid to them. Right. So that is important. For the charity to be satisfied they're dealing with an appropriate partner, they can assess the credentials of this partner, assess or analyse their reputation, and ask quite fairly, what business does this organisation have with them? Why do they want to deal with the charity? Simple checks of their legal status. So, for example, if the organisation is already regulated by another organisation or another regulator, then that can be quite reassuring and quite a simple check to make. Again, the extent of the checks is going to be proportionate, or should be proportionate to the risks. And it is difficult for charities to know if they're falling short there, but I think that's still important to bear in mind. I think with many charities, it's best practice to have a partnership agreement in place, and the partnership agreements can be quite long or short, but if you've got something there setting out what's expected of both parties, that's really important.
Well, I suppose that's become particularly important in the context of joining with fundraising organisations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's obviously led us on to a greater scrutiny in recent times of charities. So where do you find us now in that particular area of scrutiny? Where are we going? Where have we been? Are we going any further with it?
I don't think... I think that the spotlight is still very much on the third sector in that respect, and the charities and trustees can't ignore the impact of the scandals and the negative press coverage we've had. What I would say is that when you follow these principles, you are going to help discharge your duties in terms of prudence and maintaining donor confidence and so on. You're demonstrating you're doing the right thing by your supporters and by your funders, and that's really important. And perhaps the bottom line is that for trustees that can show that they've taken these steps in their decisions and their actions as trustees, that they are going to have those actions protected, and the charity as a whole will bear up much more successfully under any scrutiny or additional scrutiny that they might be under.
Lessons to be learnt.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That was very interesting. Jacqui, as usual, thank you very much.
Thanks, Malcolm.